All right, let's get started. We're about 3 minutes over, but I want to be respectful of everyone's time, and I know that the session is, we're going to get into it a bit, but I want to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. Welcome to our breakout session with a focus on district and school board leadership. The theme of this session, as you all know, is fostering a sense of urgency and action at the district level for racial equity work. For those who don't know, my name is Rodney Trice. I'm the Chief Equity and Engagement Officer with the Chapel Hill Carborough City Schools, and I'll serve as the moderator for this afternoon. But before we ask our panelists to introduce themselves and briefly talk about why it's important to create racially equitable education systems, I have a few logistics. As was mentioned in the previous session, we are guided by our code of cooperation. I know that we'll be respectful in this space and respectful of each other. And then the second piece of logistics is that our agenda, we've set aside about 40 minutes to engage with our panelists through questions that I'll facilitate. And we have another 10 minutes set aside for Q&A. So for our audience, please feel free to engage with each other in the chat, but also put your questions in the Q&A area, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can on the back end of our discussion. So with all hearts and minds ready to engage, I think we can get started. Dr. Contreras, I'm going to start with you. If you could introduce yourself and really tell us from your perspective why it's important to create racially equitable education systems. And then we'll move on to our other panelists.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for having me today. It's wonderful to be on this panel with so many of my distinguished colleagues. This is always such an important topic, and it's an interesting question because you wonder, why do we still have to ask that question? Why is this important? It's important because transforming learning actually transforms life outcomes. And if we don't transform our schools and the learning outcomes for our students, it has life and death implications for students. And we don't think about that enough, that, whether or not we teach reading well, provide access to programs equitably, actually can impact a student's life forever. And whether they live or die, the outcomes for their families. And I think that when we really embrace that and think about that deeply, we take the work we do much more seriously. So that's why we push on that so hard. And, it was a focus long before I got to Guilford County. I think that just so many things have happened that have forced us to look at this more deeply and have pushed us to push on our teachers and community and families and students to consider racial equity more deeply in Guilford County, because we are seeing the long-term consequences of not providing equitable access to students, and what happens to our community, our state, our country when we do not.
Thank you so much. Ms. Lewis, I'm going to turn to you next to introduce yourself and just respond to the question on why we're still here.
Thank you. This is important work, and I'm so into the conversation. Good afternoon. My name is Javonya Lewis, and I am a mother of 3 boys in Durham Public Schools, and I serve as a vice chair on the Durham Public Schools Board of Education in Consolidated District A. My service began from advocacy for my sons first. So since 2016, I have been in community and I have been in the schools organizing with Black parents to navigate and disrupt the public school system. There's a lot of good stuff that we have in public schools, but there's some things that also need to be disrupted to create a better learning environment for all children to be able to thrive. With the work that I began in 2016, our efforts have drawn Black parents to choosing public schools because there are parent-led initiatives that are working towards closing the opportunity gap. And they know that their children are going to be seen in those schools and taken care of, working in collaboration with our educators. We move parents from being in an affinity group to serving on the PTA to advocate for children, to join the school improvement team, to advocate for culturally responsive curriculum and goals to closing the achievement gap, the opportunity gap, excuse me, and also to being requested to have a seat at the table on district initiatives and panels. So in 2019, me and 4 community members, we began the nonprofit called Empowered Parents in Community to support this volunteer work as it was growing. And then in 2020, I ran for school board and was sworn in July 2020. So the roles go together very well in that we want to make sure we're working with parents to navigate the system, to understand the system, to work with their educators to get the best results for their kids. And we want to make sure that policies are in line with the values of the community. And that's where I ran for school board on these principles, closing the opportunity gap, helping to bring equity goals to life in this district, and really supporting the whole child with wraparound services and community schools. So I'm proud to be in Durham. I'm happy to be on this panel. And in that, the background that I want to share with you, it is super important that we strive to create a racial equity school and education system, that we're striving for this because every child should be given that opportunity to reach their full potential.
Absolutely.
We need to be willing to have conversations about race, class, bias, removing those barriers of inequities. And similar to what Nicole Hannah-Jones said yesterday, racism spills over from 1619 and it permeates every institute. So we need to give our children the opportunity to reach their full potential, as it's important for the workforce development, for economic growth, and for having a quality of life.
Thank you so much. There was so much there, and I'm going to turn to Dr. Jackson again to introduce yourself and just kind of unpack that first question for us, and then we'll turn to Mr. Bristow Smith.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for having me. I'd like to also say that I'm honored to be here and to share. And I will just echo, I think, what has already been said. I just believe that right now, as we look at the work that we're doing, we have a responsibility, I think, to ensure that I grew up in a household where it was understood that you leave it better than you found it. And so for me, there is a direct link to the work that I do every day in terms of trying to deliver on my family's promise moving forward. And that is that we leave it better than we found it. And so that means that our grandparents fought so that we could have opportunity, access, and resources. And so we don't get a pass with this generation. Our role is to continue to advocate for them, to continue to ensure that tomorrow is going to be better than today, and not spend a lot of time bemoaning today. We've got to fight through. Our parents had the intuition and the gumption, as they would call it, to stand tall and fight for us. And I think we have to bring that same level of courage to the discussions around what's best for our children when it comes to distribution of resources and access to opportunities, and ensure that we are preparing a generation of kids who are, as I say often, and people think I'm crazy, I am very committed to this generation and ensuring that they have all that they need, because we get to work on their nursery experience, and I want them to be able to be there to ensure that I have a good nursing home experience. And so they have, they deserve every single thing. So there's not a battle that we shouldn't take on if it's going to mean a better opportunity for them, so that their lived experiences can be such that we can benefit not only as a culture, but as a community and as humanity.
Yeah, leaving our system better than what we found it. I mean, that resonates with me. Mr. Bristow Smith, introduce yourself and give us your thoughts.
Thank you, Dr. Trice. And yeah, what an honor it is to be on this particular panel with these folks. Just such mad respect and love for all of you guys. And, you know, I did not know I was going to have to go after Dr. Tony Jackson. And so that, of course, handicaps me right out of the gate, Dr. Trice. But okay, I'm Matt Bristow Smith. I'm a career educator from Edgecombe County Public Schools. I've only ever held really two jobs, one as a teacher and one as a principal, all of them here in Edgecombe County. I was in the classroom for 16 years, fell in love with our kids on the margins and you know, drew myself close to the challenges that they face, some of which I came to learn are of our own making. I moved into administration, became a principal in 2014, and what a privilege it has been to lead a small school in a small district, Edgecombe County, with really big challenges. We are tackling them head on. Edgecombe County is ranked 95 out of 100 counties on the Public School Forum's Roadmap of Need, but you won't find another LEA that is tackling equity more directly and that is tapping innovation as our springboard for doing that work. Our superintendent, Dr. Valerie H. Bridges, was on the panel yesterday with Nicole Hannah-Jones. She leads us with a huge heart for kids, and I'm proud to be part of her team. In 2019, I was selected as North Carolina's Principal of the Year. And the real honor with that and the responsibility became evident as an advisor on the State Board of Education. It has been an incredible 2.5 years. I was on the board as an advisor during the pandemic. In that role, I also got to see the installation of our State Board's 5-year strategic plan. The first goal of which I'll remind everybody is that we're going to eliminate opportunity gaps in North Carolina public schools by 2025. And I would just call your attention to the transitive verb in that statement, eliminate. You know, when we're setting a goal for our state and setting a goal for our children, it's important that we don't say we're going to lessen or we're going to reduce or we're going to mitigate. We want to eliminate those opportunity gaps, because anything less than that says that we're not going to uphold our responsibilities to some students in our state. Also on the state board, I had a front row seat to the resolution for equity and excellence in education, which was our state board's first such resolution in state history. And I remember Dr. Dudley Flood challenging the board to show the moral courage to lead our state when it comes to equity. And then, of course, there was the roller coaster with our social studies standards and how important it was for some of us to fight for and for others to fight against the use of words like systemic racism in those standards. So, you know, with that, I would just say that first and foremost, I'm a school dad to 200 students here in Edgecombe County from diverse backgrounds, most of whom are first-generation college students. We lead a dream team of teachers who are committed to each and every student, not some, not most, but each and every, making sure that they get what they need. And Dr. Trice, you asked this important question about why is it important to strive for racial equity. First and foremost, it's morally the right thing to do. And I think all of our panelists today have spoken to that. It's morally the right thing to do to fight for equity. I think history also teaches us that it won't happen on its own. And so, you know, if it's not gonna happen automatically, then somebody has to lead the charge on that. It's also, you know, worth reminding everyone it's our constitutional duty that in North Carolina, it's legally required. It is our constitutional duty. And history teaches us that having laws on the books and language in our Constitution is not enough, that we actually have to fight to implement it. And it's, you know, worth remembering that it took North Carolina 15 years to implement the Supreme Court's Brown decision and to integrate our schools. So the pace of change is slow in our state. And maybe most important to your question, Dr. Trice, is, you know, and I've said this before, kids should not have to fight for racial equity. That's up to us. And so with that, I don't really want our children to be in a position where they have to fight this fight. I want us to lead that charge.
So no one told me that I was attending church today by those introductions. I'm just so inspired. So our audience will remember that our focus is on urgency and action around district-wide racial equity work. And so through our introductions, we talked about why it's important, but now I want to move to a space where we can talk about how district leaders, you know, support educators in addressing racial equity. So why is a different question than how. So I'm going to turn back to you, Matt, and if you can just give us a little bit about how you go about doing that work, making sure that educators can address racial inequities in their space?
Yeah, so thank you, Dr. Trice, for that. And I think the shift from why to how is so important because we've known the why for so long, but the how is really where the rubber meets the road. One of the things that Dr. Bridges has challenged us to do in Edgecombe County has been to really interrogate our own systems, to find out where we may be operating in good faith, but nonetheless perpetuating inequity. One of the things that's important for us to remember is that there may be a difference between our good intents and our inadvertent, accidental, possibly even unconscious perpetuation of inequities in the systems in our school systems. That means, talking about what matters to us, making sure that we line up our actions with our words. And so here in Edgecombe, and this is a really interesting question, but I wonder how many LEAs in our state have an explicit equity vision. Not just a mission statement, not just a vision for the school system that's vague and ambiguous, but an explicit equity vision that we try to live out in our work. And so Edgecombe does have that. And we align a lot of our district professional development, the leadership work that we do as principals with the superintendent and her team with that equity vision. And, ultimately that means like engaging other people in the work and helping them to navigate with us what racial equity looks like in our practice. So, one of my teachers just this past week had a courageous conversation with one of her English 9 classes about what code switching looks like. And she tied that to a nonfiction article that she was teaching and also to a fiction work, To Kill a Mockingbird. Part of my job as an instructional leader was helping her to feel comfortable and confident about what the parameters of that conversation look like, because we owe it to our children to be able to teach them skills to navigate the complex world that they live in. And code switching is a natural part of that when it comes to language. So, ultimately at the end of the day, I think we have to make sure that we elevate our commitment to kids by looking at data, drilling down into that data. You'll find that the opportunity gaps are there, and it's up to us to kind of close those opportunity gaps and to focus on outcomes and not just our intentions. Every educator is going to be an equity leader if we focus on outcomes first, not what we're trying to do, but what we're actually doing at the end of the day.
Thank you so much. Ms. Lewis, I'm going to turn to you and then also to Dr. Contreras, kind of switching between why it's important to do the work and how you all as board members and superintendents support district leaders in addressing racial equity work. Ms. Lewis, do you have any thoughts on that?
I do, thank you. I think first, just very broadly, we have to first acknowledge that racial inequities exist. There are still those who do not believe that they exist, and we have to lean in on the data, looking at the data, the disaggregated data, and just really having the real conversations that they're there. We have to insist upon professional development training, anti-racism, anti-bias training as well, and also celebrating the equity champions who are already doing the good work in the district and making sure we are removing barriers for them to continue to do the work and not be faced with additional systemic pressures or responsibilities that does not allow the equity work to continue. It's very broadly, but from a governance and policy perspective, school board members, there's work that we can do in our setting the tone in our vision, our culture, our strategic plan. So first, Durham Public Schools, we're addressing that by creating an environment that acknowledges that equity is a priority. So in our core beliefs, the first belief that we talk about in our core beliefs is that our schools and students deserve equitable access to resource. So we name equity in our core belief as our guiding principle, but it does not explicitly state racial inequities. So this is important for us to note that as well. How do we do that specifically? There's more work that we have done to address racial inequities specifically. Also, as a school board member, we can let our educators know where we stand as a board and how they will be supported by offering resolutions, weighing in on conversations that's happening across the state. DPS has passed a resolution opposing House Bill 324 that treats our educators as less than professional and dictating to them how they should teach. That talks about the critical race theory when we know critical race theory is not being taught in our schools. So we passed that resolution opposing House Bill 324. We had a resolution supporting the social studies, the revised social studies curriculum, and that there would be explicit language supporting diverse voices in our social studies standards. We also passed a resolution about the urging our North Carolina legislators to support the Crown Act to not discriminate against women's hairstyles in the workplace. So in practice, the way that looks in our school system is that we adopted a Crown Act week, the first week in March, to make sure our students are also being engaged in the conversation and knowing what the issues are around race equity in our school systems. And most recently, we passed a resolution to protect English language learners. And the last thing I'll share, and this is the most specific thing that our board has done, is we have charged the administration to bring a task force together and develop a racial and educational equity policy. This policy is our governing principle and it's the foundation. This task force was led by Dr. Kelvin Bullock, the Director of Equity Affairs, and it starts out with the shared definitions where we have shared language about what equity is and what it looks like race equity is, and there are 5 pillars to follow. So this really is undergirding our work. And we just want to we need to make sure that the resources are available to our educators to be successful in implementing these types of policies.
Thank you so much for that. What I take away from Mr. Bristow Smith and also Ms. Lewis is, one, you have to be explicit about the work, but it also has to permeate, our vision statements, what it is we believe and what we want for our students. I'm going to switch gears a bit and I'm get with Dr. Jackson and Dr. Contreras. In terms of our topic, in the previous session, there was some discussion around teacher diversity. In North Carolina, there's been a lot of urgency, around developing a diverse and representative teaching force. What can district leaders do in recruiting and retaining a diverse teaching workforce? I think as superintendents, you might have, some insight for us in that area. Dr. Jackson, could you speak to that?
Sure. First of all, I want to say that we need to recognize it as a challenge. And I am beyond the space in my journey where I am comfortable any longer admiring the problem that we have children who go through an entire educational system and never see a teacher who looks like them. So we've got to first be willing to stop admiring that as a problem and do something, which means that we've got to now develop programs, build relationships with our institutions of higher ed in our areas, and not just HBCUs. This can't be their only solution. We've got to talk with all of the IHEs and really talk about finding, nurturing, and building pathways for not only those students coming out of high school, but those who want to see it as a second opportunity career. And so we've got to be willing to disrupt what we think right now are the only pathways into the teaching profession. I often ask this question. I was a principal for a long time, and we had career day every year. And one of the things that I recognize, and again, I have to be honest and own it. I repent for it, as they say in the church. And we had tables set up all around our gymnasiums for every career except which one. Very rarely did we have a table for a teacher. And so right now, as we begin talking through this, we've got a branding issue that we've got to deal with. We've talked our way saying that we want teachers of color, but how many of us are encouraging the best and brightest in our families to pursue education as a vocation? And so we've got to own that and be very honest, and we've got to tell the truth about education as an honorable, noble profession. You won't get rich, you won't make $1 million, but you will impact your community. You will change lives. You will be able to improve the condition of the next generation. It goes back to what I said earlier about we leave it better than we found it. We've got to get back to some of those foundational principles. Stop admiring this as a problem. I'm past the point of sitting in rooms talking about this. We've got real clear expectations laid out. The Drive Task Force, they've laid out very clear recommendations for us to look at. And so that means that we've got to recruit differently. That means we have to go into spaces that we've not gone into. That means we have to have grow your own programs. That means we have to have conversations with universities about the product that they're putting out, about ways that we can get people in. That means we have to talk to that custodian, that bus driver, that teacher assistant about the teaching profession. They have the affective stuff. Now we have to give them the pedagogical part of it. So I think if we're willing to take those kinds of risks, build those kinds of bridges, I think we might see a shift in the work. Dr. Contreras, you may think differently or push me further.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Jackson. I agree completely with you. I think we have to recall, however, that there was a time, as you know, most teachers are women, but there was a time that the only professions Black women could go into were teaching and nursing. That's not true anymore. And we're not treating Black women very well who go into teaching. We're not treating them very well when they go into the principalship, when they go into the superintendency. We're not supporting them. We place them in the lowest performing schools. If they go into predominantly white schools, they are often questioned. If they try to teach about equity, they are pushed out of those schools. They are burned out from teaching in low performing schools without lots of resources. Often our Latina teachers are used as translators. So it's much bigger than the issue of just not wanting to go into teaching. They are suffering from burnout once they go into the profession. And there are so many people who say, you know, we are, you know, equity warriors, we are allies, but we never, ever see you once we are in the field. We don't see you when we're taking the hits, fighting for equity. We don't see you at the school board meetings. We don't see you in the classroom supporting us. So many people leave the field. We get people who are interested, but then they leave. And Dr. Jackson can tell you how many teachers have left, how many principals, how few leaders of color are in the superintendency. This is a problem for us. And it's a problem for not just people of color. It is a problem when you don't have adequate representation in a given field. And when people who claim to be about equity are not about equity. And I think, you know, I just want to go back to your previous question for a moment. I think we focus so much on the achievement gap that we're not preparing our educators to really advocate and see the intersectionality between inequities across institutions. Education cannot fix the achievement gap by ourselves. We just cannot do it. So we take a deep dive in Guilford County in understanding the history of racial inequity in this country, understanding the extraordinary efforts to keep people from voting in this country, the amount of Black and brown people who are incarcerated in this country, the racial wealth gap, and how that all relates to the achievement gap. I think when you grow teacher leaders and they understand those things, they can advocate and they can lift their voices about multiple issues that impact what they see in the classrooms every single day. We also spend a great deal of time on the operations side of our district, making sure there's equity in how we hire. Who's at the highest level of the organization? What do they look like? How much do they get paid? While the school nutrition workers are Black and brown women. The bus drivers who make $15 an hour are Black and brown women. And those are the folks who are most likely to be our parents. Socioeconomic status is related to academic outcomes. We cannot ignore the racial wealth gap and then think we're going to close the achievement gap. And then we help our teachers understand that there are other policies that are directly related to our decision-making, board decision-making, where teachers are placed, discipline policies, access to honors classes, AP programs, where we assign students. And, you know, we say we're about equity, but I don't want my children to go to school with those children. And we'll do everything to get our students in the best schools instead of working to make sure that we don't have students who live in the most concentrated poverty in America also going to the very poorest schools with only other poor children. We have to take all of those issues on. We have to explain that to our teachers and our community, and we have to address it one step at a time, whether people like it or don't like it. And we have to support the leaders that have the courage to take the issues on.
Thank you so much for sharing, Dr. Contreras, in terms of breaking down the systemic nature of inequities. And, I want to follow up with Dr. Contreras about, COVID-19 and how that impacted, systemic inequities. We know that, it shined shone a light on, a lot of those inequities, and more people have the opportunity to see just how deep inequities run, not only in schools, but throughout our society. So Dr. Contreras, from your perspective as a superintendent, how did that impact you and your school and your district, and how did you handle that?
And seeing how deeply the inequities were, it
Yeah.
was even overwhelming for us who know it, who grew up knowing it. Just to see, I went out and worked the food lines with the school nutrition workers who felt put upon, that everyone else was home and they had to work. So Dina Hayes Green and I got out there, the board chair, and we stood and served food with the school nutrition workers to say, if we ask you to do this, we'll do it with you. And to see just how many people were coming through who could not feed their families, to see how many families could not get online. In 2021, it is outrageous in this country that broadband connectivity is not provided as a basic service in the same way electricity is or water is. To see how many people had to share, families of 4 and 5 had to share a laptop or a device, and how many didn't have a device. We had families who came to school the Monday after the governor closed down because they didn't have a TV, a cell phone, or anything, or a laptop, and didn't know schools were closed. So for those of us who take all of that for granted, all of us who sit here and work for kids every day can tell you there are families who have nothing, who are struggling, and we take so much for granted. And we have to work on more than just teaching students to read. We have to work against work to fight all of these injustices in our society.
Thank you so much. I want to encourage our audience members to place questions in the chat. We're going to get to those in just a bit, but I want to turn to Mr. Bristow Smith and also Ms. Lewis, maybe even to close us out from the panel questions. From your perspective, given the inequities, the systemic inequities that Dr. Contreras and Dr. Jackson have spoken so eloquently about, from your perspective, what needs to happen in order to ensure that all students are receiving an equitable education and opportunities? That might be a good question to kind of close us out and then turn to the audience.
So Ms. Lewis, I don't mind jumping out front on this if you don't mind. Look, Dr. Trice, you've asked a question that I think captures the urgency of the moment. And, I'm by nature a very patient person. When it comes to these issues, I'm very impatient. We have the arc of justice in America has been a very long one. When we think about that, we're on the interval of decades and centuries for the kinds of changes that should have been made. To kind of get straight to the point, I'm quite ready for our elected leaders to stop squabbling about whether or not we are or not appropriately funding education in North Carolina. We have a nonpartisan report that has been elevated to the judicial branch, that has been carried all the way through, been fully vetted by the judicial branch, and we should not be facing a constitutional crisis in North Carolina about whether or not we're appropriately funding North Carolina and or education in North Carolina. We shouldn't have to have public leaders fighting about whether or not a nonpartisan report is valid or not. So, here I am in Edgecombe County in the rural eastern part of the state. If you look at the tier 1 counties in North Carolina and you look at where the high poverty counties are concentrated, and we know we have concentrations of poverty even in tier 3 counties, so I'm not discounting that. But look in eastern North Carolina, look at I-95, which runs north to south, and you're going to find a preponderance, the many tier 1 counties in eastern North Carolina. Embedded in those counties are children who match the profile that Dr. Contreras just described. Children who need us to act like adults and to put money and resources in place to allow the folks that are on the ground to do the work that we need. So one, I would say, fund the Leandro plan. Get that thing funded, okay? Even it in its entirety probably doesn't do the job, but that is a great starting point for us, okay? And then two, begin looking at every single decision we make in North Carolina from the perspective of how does this decision impact students and families of color and communities of color. Every single one needs to be looked at through that lens. At a district level, at a school level, we're not waiting for that to happen. We are working at a district level on the ground to try to build the kinds of systems that create the outcomes that we want. And so as an example of that, the North Carolina Teaching Fellows, as great a program as that was, sent me to college and many of my colleagues. That program in its previous iteration drew talent from Eastern North Carolina. It pulled our teaching candidates from the East and the West, and it brought them to colleges in the center part of the state: Meredith, Elon, State, Chapel Hill, and Charlotte. None of those are in the East. None of those are in the West. None of them are HBCUs. None of them match the demographics of the county that I serve in. So we've created our own program. It's like a North Carolina Teaching Fellows program. It's called the Scholar Teachers. It's a grow our own program, and private investment from folks like Corning and their Office of Racial Equality, from the Anonymous Trust, from even local contractors here in our county have created a scholarship program with the promissory note that taps our local talent and then reinvest those kids to come back and teach in our county. So the energy cannot be, I'm waiting on leadership in North Carolina, because leadership is going to keep us waiting. The energy has to be on, what does this look like? Take away all excuses. What does this look like in implementation for the kids that we currently serve?
Thank you. Ms. Lewis, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I agree. What you said about funding Leandro, our state is sitting on $6 billion that need to go and fund the needs in education. There is a deep urgency. As I began, I'm a mother of 3 boys, and I don't have time to wait for the system to self-correct. We need deep-rooted systemic change right now, so that there's a sense of urgency. And similar to what Dr. Contreras said, it cannot be on the backs of educators alone. There is an intersectionality that showed up in structural racism in our systems that have just failed so many families with COVID. And it's going to take the community authentic engagement from every system to be disrupted, to be inspected and analyzed, to create the changes that we need in our education system. It cannot be put on just the backs of our educators to make these changes. And then from a school system perspective, systemically, where there are pockets of greatness in addressing inequities, we also have structures that want to maintain the status quo. So as I said earlier, as we celebrate our champions that are looking to create some systemic change within their schools, we also need statewide standards that explicitly address measures of accountability to meeting these race equity measures in our evaluation process as well. We have to go beyond the policy and the vision. It has to be made real and people be held accountable, and not say we're going to get there, but truly get there, right? Working together in community. And the last thing I'll say is, Durham's got it going on. There's a lot of good stuff coming out of Durham, but we cannot just be talking to ourselves as we are champion education and equity. We have to be collaborating with our neighbors. We have to come outside of our silos and put pressure where our neighboring counties are being attacked and trying to maintain the status quo. We who are on the side of justice and racial equity for the students, we have to fight against this attack together in education to save our education for our students.
Thank you so much. We're going to turn to our audience questions now, and we have quite a few. So I'm going to attempt to tie a couple of those together, and I'm going to go to Dr. Jackson and Dr. Contreras first. So a number of our audience members want to know how you all as leaders kind of navigate pushback and kind of create this broad coalition of parents that can support racial equity work in schools. And kind of tied to that, a number of our audience members want some guidance in terms of how do you get communities on board or leaders on board who may not, be in a space where this type of work is encouraged. Dr. Jackson, Dr. Contreras, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I would just say that part of the work requires that we exercise a level of courage in this work and be willing to be out front and begin the conversations. But I think Dr. Contreras said a lot when she said, we have to have the Army. It's great to be an equity warrior as long as you don't have to go on the battlefield. But when it's coming at you full tilt, we have to have those individuals who are committed to the work to stand firm and say, this is the right work. And so recognizing that, I think it's important for leaders to really have their core values clearly articulated. There is definitely a cost for cowardice, and those days are gone. As leaders, we have to stand up and recognize that systems have to be rebuilt. We have to ask those hard questions. And most importantly, I think we have to be willing to help build and create systems and policies that are going to directly address these issues, be it at the governance table, be it at the administrative table, be it at the policy level in a school or practice. We've got to be willing where we see it to address it and to use our positional authority to, in fact, keep the conversation moving, keep the people at the table discussing the work that has to continue no matter what, because at its root, I say this over and over again, and it's always better to build, I think, stronger kids than it is to keep going back and fixing the adults. So if we're going to do the work, that means that somebody has to be courageous enough to plant the seed, to get out in the heat, to get out in the dirt. You've got to be courageous enough to plant the seed, and you may not even see it grow 100%. But we've got to stop building systems that are designed to fix it after it's broken. We've got to be more preemptive and proactive on the front end and plant good seeds because the tree is in the seed. And if we plant good seeds, we'll have strong trees growing. But right now, I just think that so much of our work is spent on recovery and fixing that we have missed the opportunity to plant and build our own trees. And even if we have to do things differently, we've got to be honest enough to do that and willing to do that. So the pushback is part of the work, and the pushback is going to come. But I believe that right now, as leaders, we have to be willing to exercise a certain level of courage and be willing to root that courage in true convictions about what's right for children every single day and not yield.
Dr. Contreras, do you have any thoughts on the pushback and kind of building that coalition?
Yeah, I think it's really important that we continue to try to build coalitions. I'm so proud of Guilford County and particularly the faith community. They come out more than anybody else. And I mean, that is across race. They come out and they speak against injustice more than schools of education. Unfortunately, I have to say, I don't see them. They come out more than those who say they're about, about educational equity. We don't see them, but we see the faith community. And the principles are remarkable, but we have spent 5 or 6 years really pushing on equity in every single meeting. And this is something I really try to instill in aspiring superintendents, and I train them all over the country. You cannot miss your principals' meetings. You have to be there and you have to speak, and they have to know what matters. And my principals have become so courageous. I am so proud to be the leader here. And I know that they fight for kids every day. And we don't get every decision right, but I know in our hearts, we're fighting for kids. And my leadership team, we fight for kids. And we got funding to go down to Brian Stevenson's EJI down in Alabama, and we held our retreat there. And I tell you, that got us all fired up some more. And we're just going to keep fighting and keep showing courage, and we're going to encourage teachers to have courage to do the right thing. Audre Lorde said, "My silence has never helped me. It will never help you." And I see that saying all the time. Speak up, even if your voice shakes. Just keep fighting the good fight, because we're fighting for justice and we're on the right side. We're on the right side of history. So don't give up, keep fighting. And I also tell people I am my mother's daughter. So that's why I can do this. She's a strong woman and I'm strong because of her.
Thank you so much for that. I'm ready to go. I'm fired up right now, just kind of listening to you all. We have a few more minutes, and I'm going to turn to Mr. Bristow Smith and Ms. Lewis to answer this final question from our audience, and I'm going to try to tie a couple of them together. So we know that, in speaking about inequities, discipline disparities often come up. What is, something that we can think about, we can do? What prevents us as school systems and districts and schools from, eliminating those disparities in discipline? But kind of tied to that, to something that was mentioned earlier, how can we, as school systems, also incorporate the larger local governments into addressing some of these inequities, whether it be discipline or achievement or enrichment outcomes, you name it. Mr. Bristow Smith, do you have any thoughts about school discipline in particular, or how we can incorporate a broader response to addressing inequities using our local governments?
Yeah, so two similar questions, and I'll just kind of real quickly speak to both of those. First, I'll say that tackling your code of conduct in a district is a significant undertaking. It's one of these institutions that is so easy to continue to perpetuate forward. That the code of conduct from 2010 looks a lot like the code of conduct from 2015, which looks a lot like the code of conduct from 2020, because digging in and truly looking at whether or not that code of conduct is being applied equitably and is creating disproportionate outcomes, that takes significant systemic work in a district, and it takes time. So, and I know this because in Edgecombe, we've been working on our code of conduct for the last 12 months. And so we're looking at what are iterations of this code of conduct that give children an opportunity when they do step off the path in school to try to make it right while they're in school and to get back on that path without creating this incarceration model of school discipline where an infraction occurs, a consequence is applied, and even if a student is provided due process, that due process ultimately is going to create a consequence that takes away his or her constitutional obligation or his constitutional right to be educated. Because so many of our code of conducts are written that way. They are written in such a way that an infraction occurs, a consequence is provided, and we apply those equally but not equitably. And who bears the brunt of that? Students that may not be in the center, students that are on the margins. And so I would encourage all LEAs who have disproportionate discipline outcomes, and that is most LEAs, to look at, is our code of conduct written in such a way that it gives kids restorative opportunities to get back on track while they're in school without losing time in school. And then the second thing I think, Dr. Trice, you've touched on is district leaders work in consort with county commissioners. They work in consort with county managers. They work with people who see these children on the streets. They see these children working in businesses. The same kids that sit in our seats at school are the same ones that sit in church pews. or who are customers. And here in Edgecombe, one of the wonderful things we've seen is we've seen an alignment between our community college president, who is a leader of color, our county commissioner board chair, who's a leader of color, our board of education chair, who's a leader of color, our county manager, who's a leader of color, our school superintendent and her leadership team, which are primarily leaders of color. We've seen leaders of color come together and say, we care enough about children. And these equity issues, as Dr. Contreras said, are intersectional, that when we find ways to address health issues or crime and justice issues or other issues like discipline issues, those issues are mutually reinforcing. When we create positive cycles, everybody benefits. When we create negative cycles, everyone benefits. And so it takes courage for folks to get around the table and say, we are people who have positional authority and we care about equity, even though we are in different sectors, but we're going to work together for these outcomes. I would encourage everybody to look at your county commissioner's site and see if you can find your district's data on disconnected youth. These are kids who are age 16 to 19, who are not connected with a school and are not in the workforce. That data is really illuminating, and that's a problem of practice that we across the entire state ought to be looking at, is what are we doing to help our disconnected youth? Because they become disconnected, not when they're 16 to 19, they become disconnected from birth to 16. We create that system where these kids become disconnected. That data is really essential for us to look at.
Thank you so much. Ms. Lewis, do you have any thoughts to bring us home? I know as a policymaker and activist and mom, you wear so many different hats. What are your thoughts around how local governments can aid school systems in doing this racial equity work?
Mr. Bristow Smith, he said a lot right there. The code of conduct, it does take time to change. And again, there's an urgency and I don't have that time. So fortunately in Durham, we did have our code of conduct and the committee looking at it and changing it. I want to say back in 2017. It took about 18 to 24 months for that to turn over. And for me, it's simple. Stop suspending kids. Stop, right? But what are the resources in place to help that happen? Is anyone going to be bold enough to make that policy? We're not going to suspend kids. Well, what are the alternatives? Restorative practices. How are we restoring relationships? And when we see this suspension data coming in middle school, best believe it's happening in small increments in elementary schools. That the bias in which the children are being viewed, which could just be developmental behaviors for Black children, is considered behavioral issues opposed to developmental issues. So we got to get out of this mindset and realize that there's bias that does happen. We need to have training around how to address those biases to support all kids. And it does begin early on. But going towards your question about the local government, the resources have to be there. We have to walk together, talk together about what the needs are for our youth. I just had this discussion as we're planning our joint Board of County Commissioners and Board of Education meeting. What is the data showing about how our youth in Durham are doing? Again, I don't believe it can be on the backs of educators. It does have to be a systemic approach to deal with the inequities that we have. It has to include, Dr. Contreras, I want to be part of your coalition. The faith leaders that are coming together also is important, that we're all at the same table, having a discussion, centering the conversation. Like there's an African tribe that says they greet each other with, how are the children doing? We need to be greeting each other and looking at how our children are doing across the systems. And it's beyond the local resources to support our kids. We know that we have to hold the state accountable to also release the funds, $6 billion that's being sat on. So our local funding, we go to our Board of County Commissioners, they're very giving, but we're also in a county that has the resources, in giving as much as we can to the kids and the youth, but it's not going to work if one is just pouring resources, not looking at the data across the board, looking at those kids who are disconnected and finding them, and also making sure that, again, it's a systemic approach in the community. I'm feeling a lot of pressure as you're having me close. I want to get every piece of it, but again, it goes back to making sure we have the resources so that people can do the job well. And the main thing that I hear our educators talking about beyond financial resources is time. How do we create more time? And that's putting more bodies in the school system to better support our kids.
Well, thank you so much. Y'all might think it's easy moderating all this brilliance, but it is not. I found myself wanting to take notes and then, oh, I have to ask the next question. So I certainly appreciate our panelists. You know, a couple of things that I take away. There's a certain level of courage to do this work, racial equity work in districts. We have to be explicit about our work, not only in our practices, but also in our vision statements and our belief statements, right? And so just a couple of takeaways. I want to hand it over to Lindsay, who's going to close us out. But again, thank you everyone for attending our session, and keep the fight. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Trice. And you're right, this is a really hard gig that you had to try to moderate this session, and you did it with finesse. So I appreciate that so much. You'll note in the chat, I dropped a link to the evaluation for today. Really ask that everyone take the time to fill that out. And I am just gonna share my screen real quick just to close this out today, and hopefully I'm going to do this right. Here we go. Then, okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yes, thank you.
Loading. So like I said, complete that evaluation. The link is in the chat. That really helps us keep these Color of Education summits being the incredible events that they are year after year. Then once you've done that, I would again encourage you to complete your Color of Education key takeaways in that graphic organizer. I dropped a link for that PDF document that you could print out and drop your key takeaways there. And then finally, if you would share your biggest aha from today on Twitter, that would be great. It is in the hashtag Color of Education. So engage with us on social media if you can. And then finally, we could not do this without our supporters, Burroughs Welcome Fund, Participate Learning, Peter and Sandra Conway, Blue Cross Blue Shield, as well as our other sponsors listed here. So I think we're a few minutes early ending. So if you might take this time to either A, fill out that evaluation form, or you might want to get some dinner because it's been a long day. And thanks again for all of you joining us. And we look forward to seeing you certainly next year, but hopefully sooner than that. Bye.